Hello, everyone. New York. In 1977 was a city choking on a sweltering heat wave, yet the air felt ice cold with terror. While the streets buzzed with chaotic energy, a phantom was moving through the shadows with an insatiable desire for vicious murder. Thousands of women began cutting their long, dark hair in a desperate bid to survive the night. With the discovery of the Eat Borelli letter, the city realized that in a crowd of millions, no one was safe from the son of Sam. The anatomy of the predator we know as David Berkowitz doesn't begin on a dark street in the Bronx. It starts in a hospital ward where a newborn was surrendered as a shameful secret. Before he was the most feared name in New York, he was a child of a hidden affair, an unwanted consequence, born under the name Richard David Falco. Surrendered just days after his birth, he was eventually adopted by Nathan A. and Pearl Berkowitz, a hard-working couple who provided a stable middle-class life that should have offered security. But for a boy already struggling with the invisible trauma of abandonment, this stability was fragile. Forensic psychologists often point to a single moment of truth that shattered his remaining identity: the death of his adoptive mother, Echinu Pearl, when David was only 14. She was his only emotional anchor, and her passing left him adrift in a city that felt increasingly indifferent to his existence. When his father eventually remarried and moved away, the young D. Berkowitz was left to navigate the streets of New York as a ghost. He returned from a stint in the military with a desperate, insatiable need to find his biological roots, hoping to finally answer the question of who he really was. He eventually tracked down his birth mother, Betty Falco, expecting a cinematic reunion that would provide him with the purpose he lacked. Instead, he faced a harrowing rejection. He was told he was an accidental mistake, and he discovered his mother had kept and raised another child, a half-sister who had received the love and belonging he had been denied his entire life. This second abandonment didn't just hurt, it destroyed his capacity for empathy. This is where the maid psychopath theory gains its most chilling evidence. He began to view himself as an unwanted shadow, and he decided that if the world refused to acknowledge his existence, he would force it to witness his power through a systematic campaign of destruction. But the lethal transition wasn't immediate. Before he ever targeted a human life, Inishua, David Berkowitz, turned to the flame. Between 1974 and 1977, he waged a calculated, obsessive war against the city, setting a staggering 1,488 fires across the 5 boroughs. This wasn't the work of a random pyromaniac. It was an educational documentary of his own making, a scientific approach to reclaiming control over an environment that had rejected him. He kept a meticulous journal of fire, a handwritten log where he recorded the exact street corner, the time of ignition, and the intensity of every blaze. He didn't just start fires, he managed the chaos they created. He would ignite the flame and then step back into the crowd of onlookers, watching with a predatory satisfaction as the fire department struggled to contain his handiwork. In the heat of those infernos, he was no longer the discarded son. He was the invisible director of the city's panic. These 1,488 fires served as a harrowing training ground. He was using the city as a laboratory, learning how to stalk the urban landscape, how to observe police responses, and how to vanish into the darkness without leaving a trace. He was perfecting the art of being a phantom in a crowd of millions. This period was essential to the creation of the Son of Sam, as it allowed him to test his nerves and develop the cold detachment required for what was to come. The Journal of Fire is a chilling forensic artifact because it shows the evolution of his predatory logic. He logged his failures and his successes with the detachment of a scientist conducting an experiment. He would note which materials burned fastest and which locations provided the best escape routes. By the summer of 1976, however, the smoke was no longer enough to soothe his internal agony. The fires destroyed property, but they lacked the intimate, lethal connection he truly craved. He wanted to look into the eyes of his prey and see the exact moment they realized their lives were in his hands. He traded his matches for a .44 bulldog, moving from the ashes of arson to the cold steel of murder. The predator was no longer practicing. He was ready to hunt. The transition from fire to flesh was not a sudden leap, but a calculated, harrowing evolution. By late 1975, the 1,488 fires David Berkowitz had set across the boroughs were no longer enough to quiet the voices of inadequacy in his mind. He had mastered the art of the phantom through arson, but he now craved a more intimate, lethal connection. On Christmas Eve, 1975, he decided to test his nerves with a blade. Armed with a hunting knife, he stalked the dark streets of Co-op City in the Bronx, eventually targeting two young women. One of them was 15-year-old Michelle Foreman. In a sudden, brutal eruption of violence, he attacked, stabbing the young girl repeatedly. But here, the scientific approach to his predatory development hit a snag. The knife was an intimate weapon. It required him to be close, to feel the struggle, and to manage the mess of a physical confrontation. To his frustration, Michelle fought back, and despite her injuries, she survived. For a man obsessed with absolute control, this failure was a profound psychological blow. The blade felt clumsy and unreliable. It didn't provide the immediate, overwhelming power he had envisioned during his nights in the cemetery. He realized that to truly dominate the city, he needed a weapon that offered distance, speed, and undeniable lethality. This failure led to the pivotal choice of the weapon that would define his legacy, the Charter Arms .44 Bulldog. In the realm of forensic ballistics, the Bulldog is a specialized tool, a short-barreled 5-shot revolver designed for massive stopping power at close range. It wasn't a weapon of precision. It was a hand cannon designed for destruction. By trading his blade for this revolver, Berkowitz was shifting his modus operandi from the messy struggle of a knife attack to the cold mechanical efficiency of a hit-and-run assassin. He no longer needed to grapple with his victims. He only needed to pull the trigger. This evolution marked the end of his apprentice phase. The Firestarter had become a shooter, and the summer of 1976 was about to witness the first successful application of his lethal new logic. The hunt began in earnest on the night of July 29, 1976. The location was Pelham Bay, a quiet residential pocket of the Bronx. 18-year-old Donna Loria and her friend Jody Valenti were sitting in a parked car outside Donna's Ennis apartment, talking after a night out. They were the embodiment of the very thing Berkowitz felt he could never have: youth, beauty, and social connection. From the shadows, the predator watched. He didn't shout. He didn't announce his presence. He simply walked up to the passenger side, produced the .44 Bulldog, and opened fire. The forensic reconstruction of the scene tells a story of terrifying efficiency. 3 shots were fired in rapid succession. One bullet struck Donna C. in the chest, killing her instantly. Another hit Jody in the thigh. Within seconds, the shooter vanished into the dark, leaving behind a scene of absolute carnage and 3 large-caliber lead slugs. This was the moment of truth for the NYPD. They were looking for a motive, a connection, or a reason, but there was none. This was a purely predatory act, a scientific strike against total strangers. But as investigators began to look closer at the burgeoning case, a chilling pattern started to emerge from the wreckage. It wasn't just the weapon that was consistent, it was the target. David Berkowitz had begun a systematic selection process. He was hunting young women, specifically those with long dark hair. Psychological profiling suggests that these victims represented the idealized women who had rejected him his entire life, the mother who gave him up, and the peers who ignored him. By targeting them, he was performing a symbolic execution of his own rejection. This specific selection criteria had a harrowing impact on the social fabric of New York. As news of the .34 caliber killer spread, a wave of paralysis hit the female population. Women began visiting salons in record numbers, not for beauty, but for survival. They cut their long hair short. They dyed it blonde. They hid it under hats. The simple act of sitting in a car with a friend became a high-stakes gamble with death. Berkowitz had successfully turned a demographic of millions into his personal prey. He had established his mechanical efficiency with the bulldog, and now he was beginning to realize that the fear he generated was just as powerful as the lead he fired. The city was now his laboratory, and the pattern of the predator was only just beginning to escalate into a full-scale psychological war. By the spring of 1977, New York was already a city under a psychological siege. But on the night of April 17th, the investigation took a chilling theatrical turn. In the aftermath of the lethal assault on Samri, Alexander Esau, and Dagtsin Valentina Suriani, police discovered a handwritten letter left in an envelope addressed to C. Captain Joseph Borelli, Diak. This wasn't a standard criminal communication, it was a manifesto. It was the birth of a terrifying persona that would haunt the 5 boroughs for decades. This was the first time the world heard the name, Son of Sam. The Borelli letter was a masterpiece of narcissistic delusion. It was decorated with bizarre, almost occult symbols, a fusion of crosses and strange elongated characters that defied a simple scientific approach. He wrote about Father Sam, a thirsty demonic entity that supposedly commanded him to go out and hunt the vicious streets. From a forensic perspective, this was a masterful psychological maneuver. By introducing a supernatural master, David Berkowitz was building a wall between his mundane, unremarkable life and his horrific actions. He wasn't just a drifter. He was the soldier of a demon. He was crafting a gruesome story where he was the protagonist and the people of New York were his unwilling co-stars. The language of the letter was both disturbing and surprisingly sophisticated. He referred to himself as a monster and a behemoth, reveling in the terror he projected. I am a monster. I am the son of Sam. I am a little brat, he scrawled. This revealed a man who was deeply aware of his impact on the public psyche. He wasn't just killing for a sexual thrill. He was killing for a legacy. This was the moment the .44 caliber killer became a world-renowned brand. He mocked the efforts of the police, claiming they would never find him because he was the wisp of the night and the monster that walks among you. While the authorities analyzed the handwriting, the media was already preparing to turn this communication into a citywide hysteria. The killer had successfully hijacked the narrative, transforming a series of tragic shootings into a supernatural myth that defied traditional police logic. As the hunt for the phantom continued, David Berkowitz realized that the police weren't his only audience. He turned his attention to the media, specifically the legendary journalist Jimmy Breslin of the New York Daily News. In late May, Breslin received a letter that would change the course of the investigation and the very identity of the city. Hello from the gutters of NYC, which are filled with dog manure, vomit, stale wine, urine, and blood, the letter began. It was an opening that established a tone of arrogant, predatory playfulness. The Breslin correspondence was a strategic masterclass in branding evil. While the world saw a series of senseless shootings, Berkowitz saw a promotional campaign for his own insatiable desire for fame. He wrote with a literacy that was unexpectedly sharp, filled with metaphors and a dark, rhythmic pacing. "I am still here, like a spirit roaming the night," he scrawled. He referred to himself as the beeline to the gutters and famously teased the upcoming Summer of Sam. He was creating an insatiable demand for his own gruesome stories, and the press, caught in a circulation war, was all too willing to provide the stage. This was the ultimate psychological twist. The killer was now a collaborator with the media. Every time Breslin or other journalists published excerpts of his letters, they were feeding his narcissism. The headlines didn't just report the news, they amplified the terror. Forensic analysts note that this level of media manipulation is extremely rare. He wasn't just evading the law, he was governing the city's fear. He used the press to ensure that every couple sitting in a car in Queens or the Bronx felt the cold steel of his gaze. He had successfully branded his evil, turning himself into a behemoth that defied the scientific approach of the authorities. The contrast between the content of the letters and the man himself remains one of the most intriguing aspects of the case. David Berkowitz was not a supernatural entity. He was a lonely, socially inadequate man who found power through the barrel of a gun and the tip of a pen. By manipulating the press, he ensured that his name and the terror it commanded would outlive his crimes. He had created a modern urban legend that stood in stark contrast to his remarkably unremarkable appearance as a postal worker. As the heat of 1977 intensified, New York realized it wasn't just facing a gunman, it was facing a phantom who had mastered the art of the headline. He had turned the city into his personal theater, and the world was watching every move. The hunt for the .44 caliber killer had reached a fever pitch by late July 1977, yet the predator remained a phantom. Despite the massive task force and the thousands of tips pouring in, boss David Berkowitz managed to slip through the city's fingers time and again. However, on the night of July 31st, he made a strategic shift that would eventually lead to his undoing. For the first time, he moved his vicious hunting ground from the Bronx and Queens into Brooklyn. Sitting in a parked car near Shore Parkway were Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante. It was their first date, a moment of youthful optimism that was about to be shattered by a harrowing eruption of violence. Robert Violante would later recount a chilling sensation, a feeling in his bones that something was wrong. But before he could react, the shadow appeared. Without a word, the predator opened fire with the .44 Bulldog. The forensic reconstruction of the interior of the car describes a scene of absolute chaos. One bullet struck Stacy in the head, a wound that would prove fatal. Another struck Robert in the face. The impact was devastating. In a single predatory instant, Robert felt his world go dark. He was blinded instantly, his ears ringing with the thunderous report of the handgun as he desperately tried to honk the car's horn to alert passers-by. While Stacy lay dying beside him, the shooter turned and walked calmly away into the humid night. But this time, the Phantom was not alone in the shadows. A local resident named Cecilia Davis was walking her dog nearby. In a pivotal moment of truth, she noticed a man walking toward a yellow car parked near a fire hydrant. She watched as he reached out and tore a piece of paper from the windshield. A parking ticket. At the time, she didn't realize she was looking at the face of the most wanted man in America. She only felt a sense of unease as the yellow Ford Galaxy sped away. This mundane observation, a mere fragment of a gruesome story, would become the single most important lead in the history of the NYPD. It was the crack in the sociopath mask that the scientific approach of the task force had been waiting for. The investigation that followed was a masterpiece of systematic police work. While the public craved a high-tech breakthrough, the resolution of the son of Sam case came down to a mountain of paperwork. Investigators began a relentless search through every parking ticket issued in the vicinity of the Brooklyn crime scene on that specific night. This was the scientific approach at its most grueling. They weren't looking for a fingerprint or a DNA match. They were looking for a forensic linkage in the city's bureaucratic records. Out of the thousands of citations, they found one issued to a yellow Ford Galaxy with a license plate registered to a man in Yonkers. That man was David Berkowitz. On the morning of August 10th, 1977, the task force descended on an apartment building at 35 Pine Street. They found the yellow car parked outside. Inside, resting on the seat, was a duffel bag containing a rifle and a letter addressed to the vicious task force. This was the definitive evidence. As David Berkowitz walked toward his vehicle, he found himself surrounded by armed detectives. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a city-wide relief balanced on the edge of a trigger finger. In a high-stakes moment of confrontation, Detective Filotico pointed his service weapon at the suspect's head. He expected a struggle, a vicious outburst, or perhaps another attempt to flee. Instead, he was met with a chilling, predatory calm. David Berkowitz didn't reach for a weapon. He simply looked at the detective and smiled. "You got me," he said in a voice that was hauntingly soft. "I'm Sam." This wasn't the defiant roar of a monster. It was the quiet admission of a man who had finally run out of shadows. The emotional payoff for the city was monumental. The arrest of Berkowitz brought an immediate end to the summer of Sam. But it also highlighted the triumph of relentless systematic forensics over the chaotic whims of a predator. He was taken into custody not because of a supernatural slip-up, but because of a simple parking ticket. The Phantom had been unmasked by the very bureaucracy he had spent 1,488 fires trying to manipulate. As he was led away in handcuffs, the world finally saw the face of the .44 caliber killer and found it remarkably unremarkable. The vicious myth was dead, replaced by the reality of a lonely man in a yellow car. But as the sirens faded, the scientific approach would turn its focus to the most disturbing question of all. Why did he do it? Following the arrest of David Berkowitz, the narrative of the .44 caliber killer took a bizarre, almost supernatural turn that captivated a nation. To the public, the monster was finally unmasked, but to the legal system, the challenge was just beginning. In a series of harrowing interviews, Berkowitz presented a psychological defense that seemed to defy all logic. He claimed that he wasn't acting of his own volition. He spoke of a 6,000-year-old entity that communicated through the howling of a black Labrador retriever owned by his neighbor, Mosh Sam Carr. According to Berkowitz, this Father Sam demanded blood and commanded him to kill. It was a story perfectly tailored for an insanity plea. However, the scientific approach of the court's psychiatric experts revealed a much more depraved reality. While the public was focused on the howling dog, psychologists were deconstructing a man driven by social inadequacy and a distorted sexual thrill pattern. They argued that Berkowitz didn't hear demons. He simply found the power of the .44 bulldog to be an intoxicating substitute for the human connection he had never achieved. The insanity was a mask, a tactical hoax designed to manipulate the system just as he had manipulated the media through Jimmy Breslin. Years later, he would eventually admit that the entire Son of Sam story was a lie, a fabrication meant to provide a supernatural excuse for his calculated atrocities. But the aftermath of evil often leaves behind questions that forensics cannot easily answer. This leads to the twist that continues to haunt investigators: the cult theory. Throughout the 1977 spree, witness descriptions of the shooter were notoriously inconsistent. Some described a tall man with blonde hair. Others saw the short, dark-haired Berkowitz. This discrepancy led to the suspicion that he might not have acted alone. Berkowitz later fueled these theories by claiming he was part of a satanic cult that included Sam Carr's own sons, John and Michael Carr. Both brothers died under mysterious circumstances shortly after the arrest, leaving a void where the truth should be. While the police officially closed the case, the possibility of a predatory collective remains one of New York's most enduring cold case mysteries. The legacy of David Berkowitz also forced a dramatic change in the realm of criminal law. To prevent criminals from profiting from their gruesome stories, the Son of Sam law was enacted. This educational milestone in legal history ensured that the money from book deals or movie rights would go to the victims' families rather than the predator. It was a systematic effort to strip the monster of his celebrity and restore a sense of justice to the survivors. As the legal circus ended and Berkowitz was sentenced to 365 years in prison, the city began to heal. The summer of 1977 eventually cooled, but New York City was forever altered by the shadow of the .44 bulldog. Today, David Berkowitz remains behind bars, but the predator who once claimed to hear demons has replaced his vicious mask with a Bible. He now calls himself the Son of Hope, spending his life in prayer and counseling. This transformation remains one of the most polarizing chapters of his gruesome story. For some, like Nasa Moskowitz, the mother of his final victim, the only path to peace was the impossible act of forgiveness. Before she passed, she chose mercy over an insatiable cycle of hatred, offering a rare moment of redemption in a narrative defined by blood. Yet, as the legacy of that harrowing summer lingers, we are forced to confront a chilling truth. A single unremarkable man proved that terror only needs a name to paralyze a city of millions. He didn't just take lives, he stole the city's innocence. Can a monster truly be redeemed? Or is the Son of Hope simply the final masterful performance of the Son of Sam? Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the cases that forever changed our understanding of human nature. We will see you in the next investigation.